Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here. This week I'll be bringing you the third and final episode in my trilogy of T-60 videos. Yep, you guessed it, it's a diorama base. Well, more like a vignette as it's pretty small. Anyway, I think it came out looking pretty interesting, so let's get into the video. Before anything else, I first needed to carve out the basic shape for the base using a normal kitchen carving knife. This was pretty difficult as the size of the blade increased the friction with the foam massively. So if you have a wire foam cutting tool, definitely get this out for any cutting steps required. Using a normal scalpel blade, I created basic ruts and tracks in the foam, roughly where the tracks of the T-60 would sit. However, this ended up being completely in vain as the clay I would later use was entirely cover up all the impressions I carved out. Oh well. Moving on to the clay now. For this I used Das air drying clay as it was by far the cheapest and most accessible option I had available. I do find though that this product is super slimy and a bit weird to work with, so you may want to try other options in order to find what you like the best. I used water to smooth out any imperfections in the clay and also to soften up the areas where I'd pressed the track marks into. Unfortunately for this I had to use the tank itself as there were only 5 or 6 tiny track links left that I could have used. This turned out to be fine though, as in the end I would just repaint any bits of white clay with turned dirt enamel paint. The first texture that I laid down on the base was accumulated dust. I chose this purely because it was a pretty cool gritty appearance that in this case would represent any small stones or larger bits of dirt on the ground. I applied all textures using a fairly big brush and a stippling motion. After applying the accumulated dust, I decided that the T-60 was levitating too much off of the ground, so I reapplied a bunch of clay in the areas that the tracks would sit. This was softened up once more, and the track marks were again pressed into it. In the road section of the vignette, I applied the next texture, this time wet ground, another of AK's Diorama series of textures. Just like it says on the tin, this stuff has the appearance of softened wet ground, which is perfect for a waterlogged winter road in Russia. I used a variety of model railway ballast to add stones and rocks to the vignette. These were placed carefully in certain areas with a palette knife and a pair of tweezers for some larger stones. In the end, these would be painted in a variety of colours to add interest. All of the ballast was fixed down using heavily diluted PVA glue, which in hindsight I really should have first applied alcohol in order to break the surface tension, as the watered down PVA on its own struggled to disperse over all of the stones. To finish off the stones, they were finally blended in with some AK wet ground texture, just like before. Next came the vegetation. For this, I used a combination of pre-made grass tufts and custom-made tufts that were formed out of 5mm long static grass. Both were fixed to the base with PVA glue, which is actually surprisingly effective once you give it enough time to properly dry. All of the grass would later be painted with my airbrush, so the colour at this stage doesn't matter at all. On one side of the base I also drilled some holes and stuck in some long dried grass stalks. This added a nice bit of height to the vignette, as well as some variation in the vegetation. With everything stuck down to the base that I wanted, it was time to prime it up, ready for paint. This was done using my favourite Mr.Surfacer 1500, thinned to about 50% with Mr. Colour Levelling Thinner. It didn't end up taking to the grass tufts very well, which wasn't that big of a deal. I was mainly applying the primer to unify the dirt and stones on the road. The main earth tone that I used to paint the base was XF52 Flat Brown, and I applied this in an even coat everywhere, including around the vegetation. This was sprayed through my Infinity at roughly 20 psi, though you may want to go lower on pressure depending on your paint thinning ratio. I added quite a bit of black to the XF52 and then sprayed this a lot on the dirt road itself. The intention here was to make it look a lot thicker and wetter from all the snow that had melted into it. Now time to paint the grass. I roughly mixed XF5 and XF67 in a ratio of 50% to achieve a nice green tone that suggested a slight hint of fading from a summer or summer grass tone. I then lightened this colour later on and sprayed it quickly over the tops of the tufts to add some diversity in the colour. The dried grass stalks were painted with desert yellow straight from the bottle. This actually worked out really nicely, as the bottom parts of the stems ended up being flat earth because of the overspray from the ground. This created a great looking effect that really made them look like some sort of crop or dried plant. As I said earlier, at this point I painted a lot of the individual stones with a handful of colours, as you can see on screen. This would almost entirely be obscured by the snow sprinkles later on, but it was nice to see all the different colours on there to begin with. For this purpose I used the smallest brush I owned to maximise the accuracy of the paint's placement. Then I moved on to using enamel products. I started off with a turned dirt effect from the Ammo by Mig Splashes range, and this was very roughly blended into the dirt road using white spirit and the same sized paintbrush that I used to apply the acrylic texture earlier. This really helped to diversify the range of tones on the dirt road, and even helped to make it look muddier and more waterlogged. Next up I used a dry earth enamel effect, this time focused around any high points or tops of the ruts on the dirt road. This represented areas that had formed a thin crust due to the sun's heat and therefore appear more dehydrated than the rest of the ground. Now for the snow sprinkles. I used the same AK product that I used on the tank, and I absolutely love it. The effect it creates is super authentic, and when you catch it from certain angles it actually sparkles. This, just like the ground textures, is an acrylic product, so can be thinned and sort of blended with tap water. At this point I felt like the vignette was still a bit empty, so I decided to paint up a damaged oil drum that could be rusted at the side of the road. I started by basing the drum with a custom mixture of XF6, XF7 and 9 until it looked about right for my taste. I then added a lot more XF9 to the mix and sprayed this along the ribs on the outside of the drum. Following a coat of matte varnish, I then applied chipping varnish to the oil drum. My plan was to create a very rusty, degraded appearance with rust showing through under faded German grey. The German grey itself was essentially straight from the pot, though with a few drops of white added to emphasise the faded appearance. Next I again sprayed along the ribs, this time with normal German grey, giving some variety in the shading. Once the paint was dry, I could simply use tap water to chip away at the German grey, exposing rust underneath. Looking back at this, I probably should have left the different layers to dry for longer, as I somehow managed to expose the sand-coloured plastic in some areas. This though was easily cleaned up. The sides of the base were painted normal flat black. I created the sharp edge with a brush, as you can see, and then filled in the rest with my airbrush, as it's much more time and paint efficient. And here we are. This is where I decided to call the vignette done. In my own humble opinion, I think it looks pretty good, though looking back at it, I most likely should have left the road clear of snow, or at least for the most part, as this is where it would have melted the fastest with vehicles crossing and water draining onto it. The snow effect is nice though, so I don't think this is too big of a deal. I do also think that the T-60 fits very nicely into it as well, as I was worried that it wouldn't sit well both physically and aesthetically, as a snow base is somewhat harder to pull off than other seasons. Well, I look forward to making more bases in the future. Just a quick PSA for those of you expecting another video in a week's time. I'll be skipping an upload as of when this video comes out, allowing me to get ahead of my upload schedule. From then on it should be weekly uploads again. Well, that's it for today. Make sure to comment what you think below, and if you enjoyed the video, feel free to drop a like, it really helps me out. And if you didn't enjoy, leave a dislike and explain why in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!